Okay, let's get started, and we'll have, like every book club, there's always folks who are, coming in as the wine is opened and so forth. So let me thank Jaap-Henk Hoepman for joining us, and let me thank him for Privacy is Hard and 7 Other Myths. I really enjoyed this book. I confess, from the title, I thought it was really going to be sort of, arguing about some policy issues, and we get that as sort of a structure for the book, which I think was sort of helpful in walking through. But hidden behind the title is an incredible primer, frankly, on achieving, well, which is what he says, right? A real primer on achieving privacy through careful design. I've been, like many of you, working in this area for a long time, and there was a lot, frankly, I learned by the fact that he ends up treating some issues in a very high level, beginner way, and then dives deep enough that those who have perhaps some more technical chops are also learning things new. So the bad news is, as I was sitting there, he would also cite different books that I should read. And so I now have 3 more in the stack, and perhaps this is part of being a professor and a teacher. A lot of the material really was presented in a way that I can imagine, sort of sitting in a class and needing sort of some of the background to walk through. All right, let me jump in with the introduction of our author, Jaap-Henk Hoepman, who is Associate Professor at the Institute for Computing and Information Science at Radboud University, Nijmegen. You'll help me if I miss in the Netherlands. And of course, he's as well an Associate Professor at the IT Law section in Transboundary Legal Studies at the Faculty of Law at the University of Groningen. And someone well known to many of us who are interested in privacy and technology, privacy by design, for his privacy by design patterns and other work that has been really great. Joining me, and you're all equals here in the background, so post and we'll try to bring in your questions, but joining me, some folks who I know enjoyed the book as much as I did, are Gloria Gonzalez Fuster, who is research professor at VUB, University of Free Brussels, and co-director of LSTS, the Law Science, Tech and Society Research Group that does some of the really interesting work coordinating and bringing together academics and other experts. Gwendol Legrand, who many of you know from his long tenure at the TNIL, but maybe don't know that he has recently moved over to play a European-wide role. He's long played a European-wide role, but now officially sitting and supporting the data commissioners throughout Europe with enforcement, support, and coordination. So we're not going to talk about his new job. We're here just to hear what he thinks about the book and his thoughts on the issue. Everybody who's here is here just as participants in a book club. Nobody's representing any official policies or organizations unless you have something in particular. Katarina Korna may be newer to some of you because she's newer to the privacy space, but long, deep experience. But the new senior fellow at IAPP for, Katarina, how do we say it? For privacy engineering, for...
Yes, privacy engineering. Yes, we want to convey more topics. And yes, and today's my first day, so it's really great to start it off with you, all of you. So thanks for inviting me.
She comes with experience from the Austrian Ministry for European and International Affairs and previously the Ministry of the Interior. So although she's over on this side of the Atlantic in the Bay Area, comes with background in government in Austria. And of course, Naomi Lefkowitz, Senior Privacy Policy Advisor in the Infotech Lab at NIST, where she has long played a role in helping move privacy engineering, privacy standards, and welcome. Finally, Rob Van Eyck, our Managing Director for Europe, and a good friend and fan of our author. So Jaap-Henk, let me jump in. We owe you a real depth of gratitude for the book, but It's not an academic book exactly. It's not really something I expect to see at the airport for, the travelers to pick up. It's really exactly for us, frankly. But who were you aiming at? It's a little more technical than the very general, person, because you got to really read it, although it's very accessible. I mean, walking through, I think I never fully understood, some of the key encryption stuff, the way you really just set it out with Mr. Darcy and so forth. Really, really lovely. You can see that this is a teacher, at heart. But what drew you to sort of create this hybrid that, like, I think is perfect for our audience? And so thank you for writing for us. But, as an academic and as an expert, who were you trying to reach? How did you come up with this interesting kind of hybrid of an accessible book that has some, catchy themes and organizing principles, but it's also a real education for technology and for anyone who's interested in kind of really working in this space?
Well, thanks, Jules, for the question. And of course, first of all, thank you for inviting me on this book club, discussing my book. That's really an extreme big honor, and all these people joining and being able to discuss the book. I was sort of like first starting this book as a say more like a course book for courses that I teach for computer scientists about privacy by design, privacy enhancing technologies, because that's not out there. And then a friend of mine, when walking around here in the countryside, he told me, like, this is a topic that's much more important than just your students. This is more general relevance. And indeed, like, if you look around, there's very few. I mean, there's many books about the problem, like legal or whatever, but there's very, very few books about how you can solve the problem from a technological point of view. And I was like, I think it's important to at least show to the general audience that there are solutions out there, that most of the stuff, the systems that we use are designed in a certain way because of certain reasons that we maybe will talk about later. But there's also an alternative path that you can really design these systems in a much more privacy-friendly way. And what I wanted to do was to explain this to a more general audience. Like you said, this is not going to be an airport book, but I'm sort of hopeful that, like, anybody with a reasonable education should be able to get the gist of what is being presented in the book. And of course, there was also the ulterior motive of, like, addressing policy people, non-technical people with an interest in privacy, to also tell them about the possibilities that are out there, like, and really telling them, like, technology is not only out there to get us, but technology is also out there, could be out there to help us. So that was basically the main reason.
I'm going to flag a couple of the Post-its that I was sticking as I was reading it through. I'm going to let you respond, and then I'm asking the rest of our folks here to sort of jump in with something you liked, something you didn't like, something you would like to have had more of. So as I was flipping through, I was appreciating kind of some of the lesson around purpose binding being such a fundamental cornerstone, and how data protection is, like a carefully crafted house of cards that collapses as soon as one of the cards is removed. And I think that's super helpful when you do this work globally as we do, and you see sort of portions of what look like good data protection law being put in. We have now some very nice elements of data protection law in some of the new state laws, but then they completely don't address another area. And so the reality that, doing these things and taking a piece from GDPR and a piece from here, as opposed to understanding that there's really a complicated puzzle, and it may not be what it's purported to be if you don't seriously address the key issues. I thought it was interesting that you really made the statement that hard privacy, as opposed to soft privacy, that you really can't solve problems only with hard privacy without a loss of function. And you sometimes see people talking about, there's no conflict. You can have, privacy, and you don't need to lose, the utility. And I think you make the case that, well, sometimes we want to lose that utility, that friction is some activity that maybe we don't want to see happen. But you certainly have, people out there sort of sometimes making it clear that there should be no trade-offs, and that you can win. You just need to, handle the technology in a sophisticated way. And so I wonder whether you'll share some of your views on some of the recent efforts, maybe the Apple CSAM effort, which again is a very engineered effort to maybe do some hard privacy, but obviously has been a source of debate. Maybe the new efforts by the browsers and Google and others with Flock and these other, technologies, again, very engineered, but clearly, maybe you mentioned these all a little bit. I think the contact tracing apps, again, very engineered, right? Lots of privacy and technology, but also certainly weren't magic bullets when it came to, satisfying people. So just a couple of thoughts, would love your reactions, and then I'll ask the others to jump in.
Sure. No, you're touching upon an important topic with actually a few different dimensions. I think there's one dimension is the dimension of, okay, so can you implement systems with the same functionality, but with more privacy protection in place? I think in many cases this is possible. So a hard privacy approach in many cases is feasible, but this is not the only way. At some point, you'll have to rely also on laws and other more softer tools to get what you want. And the whole point of the GDPR is to end the legal system in the European Union to protect privacy, or at least protect data protection. Sometimes you need that as well. So that's one thing. The other thing is the question of if something is indeed done in a privacy-friendly way, does that necessarily mean that it is a good idea to do it? And this is, for instance, if you talk about things like contact tracing, a similar thing is like related to federated learning, where you do most of the learning on the device itself. You could argue that because you do things in a peer-to-peer local fashion, it is much less privacy infringing than doing it on a central server, but still other risks remain. So there is this, I think, woven through the book. There's several examples where touching upon this, like, okay, you can use the technology to protect privacy up to a certain point. And if you would really, really engineer harder and harder and harder, you would maybe, etch a few more slivers of harm from the system. But at some point, I mean, you've got to stop and you've got to rely on other measures to offer the final leg of protection. And maybe that also works the other way around. And there's the question of like the things around things like, okay, so we have a surveillance system, but it is privacy friendly. What does that even mean? Sometimes this label of this is privacy friendly, or this is privacy by design, is used as a fig leaf for something else. So this is something to be aware of when talking about privacy in all these different contexts.
Gloria,
as a quick response.
I assume you liked the book. Tell us if you didn't.
I do. I like the book. I'm a satisfied customer. I recommend the book. I also have plenty of post-its.
Thanks.
And I really liked it. And I have to say, I've been looking forward to reading this book for a little while. And I'm very glad to share my anecdote about this. I think I met Jaap-Henk 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. I don't know, because time flies. And I asked him randomly at a conference, how are you doing? How do you do? And normally you have a normal reply, but he said, great, great, great. So, ooh, like, it's very surprising to have somebody who is so happy and say, what is happening? And he said, well, I just signed this manuscript with a publisher. I'm going to write a monograph about privacy by design. And he was like super, super excited. And I've never seen anybody so excited about writing about privacy by design. And I thought, well, that's great. And I look forward to reading this book. And I have to say that when I finally read the book, I do agree with this idea that it's a bit of a hybrid book. It's like a bit of two books. So now it's nice to have heard this explanation. I think, indeed, I thought it was going to be a book like, say, privacy by design. And it doesn't say in the cover, this is about privacy by design. It is broader than privacy by design, but in the end, it is about privacy by design very much. And that's interesting, I think, because indeed it can be useful, and it can be also perhaps not the natural expectation of people that they will read about privacy and it will be about privacy by design. But it's interesting. I don't know who is the ideal audience, but I can say that this morning I was teaching data protection, the GDPR, and I had to teach data protection by design. And I stole already one of the examples here, because this is really it's really, really useful. I talk about the parking, and then I could feel the students were following the car, the parking, imagining all this data here and there. So it's really, really useful, I think, to talk about technology to people who maybe don't master everything. There are many, many useful examples, and this is something I really, really like. So you already explained, I had this question about how did you live with this fact that it was not really just about privacy by design. I don't know if this was painful for you, that you had to talk more also about privacy in general, or you were happy to do this and to broaden the scope. I suppose it was fine. And then I had another little question that I wanted to ask. So Jaap-Henk, I know you have been presenting your book already in a number of places, and I suppose you already presented this to the controllers or the people who are not designing things properly. And I wonder, how do they react? Because in a way, this reminded me very much about my mother. So my mother, occasionally, she has this remark. She says, you see, when you try, you can be really nice. And I never know how to react to this. Is this a compliment? Is this not a compliment? That if I try, I can be nice? Is she trying to tell me that I'm not trying, that I'm not nice? And I think you're saying a bit the same thing to everybody, saying, yes, and you could, it's not that complicated. You are not really trying. Why don't you try? So do they take this nicely? Do they think you are actually just not being nice to them? How do they just respond to this?
Yeah, that's it. Oh, I love that question, Gloria. Thank you, and thank you for the kind, warm words. I guess I must have been radiant when I got that contract signed. Yeah. So actually it's sort of interesting to see that a lot of the response I get out of the community is actually from DPOs or engineering teams out there in the wild, so to speak, having to deal with these issues, that are really happy that they finally get something that allows them to move forward. Because the problem for them mostly is like, okay, you know, there's the business that says, okay, we want this functionality. Then there's the lawyer saying, you know, you have this GDPR and you have to comply. And they're like, help, what do I do? And so I already, before this book, I wrote this little blue book about the privacy design strategies that is sort of like in the back of this book as well. And I start to discover that this thing sort of like has been growing under the ground and reaching everywhere, and people have been using this to set up all kinds of like engineering processes to make their engineering team work in a more privacy friendly way. So they mostly respond in a sense of like, okay, we're being enabled to act responsibly, so to speak. And then of course there's always a small group of people that, you know, didn't want to be nice to begin with. Well, you know, then yeah, then all your bets are off, and then you have to do something else. And in regard to your first question about did I like or not like to write about beyond privacy by design? No, actually, this is what I liked most. Actually, at some point, you're like, okay, if you have to talk about the real technical stuff, then it's almost like, yeah, this is, for me, it's very obvious. So then it's more like the challenge of like how to get the right metaphor to explain it to a broader audience. But really talking about this interplay between law and the social sciences and the technology, and like trying to find a kind of like middle ground between the hardcore hard privacy people and the softer privacy people is very interesting, because you know, I've always been into this kind of like intersection of different worlds, and I enjoy that a lot, actually.
Well, speaking of people who live at the intersection of hard technology and law, Gwendal, how did the book come over to you? What stood out as something you really resonated with?
Hi everyone. First of all, I'd like to say I had time to go through the soft copy of the book, not the hard copy of the book yet, but it was very, very interesting and easy to read with very concrete examples. This is what I like, basically. Like Gloria was saying, you know, you say, this is a system that everybody has seen, and you show in different contexts that there's different ways of designing it, and there's ways that are more privacy friendly than others. And this is what we want people to do at the end of the day. We want them to think, when they're designing a system, whether or not the solution that they're implementing is the right one. So at first, when I saw the title of the book, I thought I would be left without, and I looked at the outline, I would be left without a job at the end, because you're always saying, you know, there's a myth and then it's busted. But thank God, when you read Privacy is Hard, the conclusion is it's not hard if you try and if you redo all the plumbing. So we still have quite a lot to do. So I'd like to start by borrowing a question from you that you had asked a couple of months ago when we were on the common defense together. If there was two things you could fix in the plumbing, what would you start with? That's the first thing I would ask.
Yeah, I think I would try to. One thing that I would really want fixed is the sender anonymity, or the lack of sender anonymity in the internet. So the fact that whenever you connect from your computer to a web server, your IP address is basically revealing who you are. The problem is that, like, almost all the privacy enhancing technologies, designs that we built on top of the internet sort of assume that we have sender anonymity, or they assume that, like, okay, well, you know, we have this protocol, but then the server will play nice and will not record IP addresses, which of course it does. So this is a lie, roughly, very bluntly saying. But if there would be sender anonymity, so if you could connect to any web server without revealing your IP address, then suddenly this assumption is true. Suddenly, all these privacy enhancing protocols that rely on sender anonymity would actually, you know, deliver to their promise much more than before. So that would be one of my first things that I would want it fixed in the plumbing. And I must say that there's a positive progress being made on that front. There's standards out there for that. There's actually a beta product from Apple that delivers that. There's, of course, Tor, the onion router, that already delivers that to the hardcore privacy activists. So there's something out there. And I think the second thing that I would want fixed maybe is a return to the more open nature of the internet, like so basically destroying the walls between the gardens that have been constructed now. I always say, like I can email anybody independent of the email client that they use, but when I'm on Signal, I cannot send a message to anybody on WhatsApp, even though the protocol is exactly the same. So I would also want that fixed, because that allows also different kind of infrastructures to grow and to compete with the more monopolistic infrastructures that we have now. That's actually more general than only privacy. Actually, that is maybe broader.
Okay, yeah, indeed, and it's basically saying, well, the foundations of the internet, you were sending messages from one point to another, and now, in a way, with the way we built the internet and the applications, you connect to a platform which is a new centralized way of communicating. Basically, this is what you're saying. Yeah. One thing also that you said earlier in the discussion is that if it's done in a privacy-friendly way, it's not always a good idea. So I agree with this in principle, but isn't GDPR already dealing with this? Because when you look at the principles in GDPR, you need to pass a kind of necessity test. You need to have a purpose that meets certain requirements. And then once you have validated the fact that your system is necessary and the purpose is fine, then you design the system in a privacy-friendly way. So, I mean, I'm very happy with the examples, but I didn't quite follow. I fully understand the reasoning when you say, well, it's not necessarily a good idea, but are you just rephrasing what is already in the law, or are you requesting something different?
That's a very good question, but maybe not something that you should ask a computer scientist by training. I'm not sure whether the GDPR covers all the cases that I have in mind, in a sense that, like, things like contact tracing for dealing with the COVID crisis, or other kinds of, like, technologies out there. but this is more related to the discussion around techno-solutionism. Like the question often is like, is it really helpful to introduce a technology to solve a problem in the first place? And this is partly a privacy problem, but not only that, there's also other problems. And so you could maybe argue from a legal perspective that if there's another approach that doesn't involve the technology that solves the problem as well, then because of the target binding, purpose binding principle of the GDPR and the proportionality test, then this technology should not fly. It would be in violation of the GDPR. I guess that's a bit pressing the argument there. But like I said, I'm not a lawyer. So
Jaap-Henk,
I think there's more to that than the GDPR, let's say.
Yeah, I think you touch on a really interesting, big legal philosophy question that some of us have. Is data protection the law of everything, where the wisdom of data protection experts are assessing what is necessary, what is legitimate, not just from a technology point of view, but how do we rank these ideas in society? We have a data protection authority in the Netherlands, I guess, where the commissioner took the point of view that something isn't legitimate unless it's set out in the law. And okay, that's one way to look at it. Or is it is privacy the law of everything, as one academic wrote in a paper, or is it that other democratic legislators and so forth make certain decisions, and then we incorporate that consensus. But anyway, hard questions. Yeah,
but like you said, Jules, like in your introduction, like the whole thing is really a carefully crafted house of cards, and especially the issue of purpose is something that has not really been discussed a lot. Like, okay, I mean, if you have purpose binding, you have to talk about what is a reasonable purpose. And I don't have the impression that there's a lot of clear guidance in terms of like, okay, what is an appropriate purpose for a company to pursue? Is it really a good purpose for a company that is in the business of making shoes to do targeted advertising on a specific thing, or to collect personal data for other purposes to make money out of that? Is that these kind of things are sort of left out there in my mind.
Yeah, Naomi, let me bring you in as the one of the leading voices on standards. I will say, what was your what resonated with you from the book?
Well, I mean, I really like the way it was organized around sort of the myths. I mean, I think that was very accessible. And Gloria, since you opened the door on parents, I would like to share the chapter on I have nothing to hide with my father, because every time we talk about my work, he always ends with, well, I have nothing to hide. I'm like, thanks a lot, so much for my career. But but no, and seriously, I actually, I want to follow up on this contact tracing point and this sort of issue of I think it's sort of partly an issue of these trade-offs and partly an issue of, did it solve anything? And I think one of the interesting things is because, we were doing work on this at NIST as well. And we had, we came out with a slightly, a little bit different solution, which, we thought had even stronger privacy properties. But we also felt like it sort of didn't necessarily work in every situation, like every context, because it required some trade-offs. But then we had this workshop, and I think what we all took away from it, which was so interesting, was that the sort of epidemiologists were like, if they talked to us, we would have told they didn't really want what they got, right? Like they have certain goals for contact tracing, and the app wasn't really meeting that. And I think that to me is sort of one of the one of the core issues with sort of the relationship of these technologies and privacy by design is that communication between sort of, what's the goal and then what can we design? Because, we sort of turned away from it, NIST, a little bit and sort of focused on what we're calling encounter metrics, which is sort of an anonymous way to sort of understand, how many people are in a space. We don't need to know who, but we would like to know at different times so that then we can manage the environmental, controls and understand sort of the proximity and all those kinds of things, which evidently is more usable, right, to both those who are trying to open up spaces and prevent infections, and potentially also to epidemiologists who want to know where the sort of the hotspots are. So in a funny way, like if we had that conversation early on with epidemiologists, we actually could have a solution that has a lot of privacy and meets better needs. So sometimes I think it's almost about like, and we hear this so often, right? This lack of communication with the right parts of organizations or stakeholders. And I don't know, I would just, so I really liked, your book in terms of being able to encourage that conversation. And I would just sort of say, we really have to go even further with that kind of communication.
Thank you, Naomi, for that comment and that plea for getting more stakeholders involved early on in the process, because that's exactly what I was talking about earlier. Like, before you decide to introduce a certain kind of technology, you really have to know what the requirements are and what the needs are of different stakeholders or people affected. And this is something that is often overlooked. And if you focus on privacy, you only focus on a small aspect of this, but there's more related issues around autonomy, etc., that have an impact there as well. So I totally support that. And yeah, if my book contributes to that, that will be great.
Although, of course, we still have the tension because the people who want the data, often, whatever their sector is, want often maximum functions and maximum ideas. And the pushback at the democratic legislative process or at the data protection process, where we say, no, you don't really need that. That is extra. That is right. That is going to make you the money to pay for it. And they say, well, that's actually essential, or that's going to help you, market it, or that's, that's a very long time to keep the data for the tax purpose. And I'm sure there are tax experts who have logical reasons why they think they need it. So I think it's as data becomes key to everything, we're going to have so many societal clashes. And at the end, the courts, I guess, are the place that we'll see some of these decisions. Speaking of that, Katarina, welcome to the discussion. Tell me your thoughts.
Yeah, so what I liked about the book was, I can just reiterate that I really like this interdisciplinary approach between IT and legal, because this is so needed. And like you said, Jules, there are so many basic concepts that we currently constantly hear about or use. And some of them I did not understand in this easy, accessible way yet, as you described them. And that's, the main part of the book, the middle is really explaining very basic IT solutions in an accessible way. And I think that alone is really a reason to have the book in the shelf and use the index, because what I missed a little bit was the content at the beginning, that I know where is what and so on. So that's maybe, Jules, why you have so many paper sticky notes in the book. I also it's all colorful, my book. And what I want to ask is, and I'm so happy, Naomi, that you're also here, because I'm a big fan of any frameworks and standards and graphics. And I saw also on LinkedIn that some people really liked the graphics, not only me. And there's this in the chapter 8 at this, where we have the, so for everyone who has not read the book yet, there's a graphic, which is the system life cycle. Yep. And we have the privacy design strategies mapped to ideation and definition, and privacy design patterns to design, and privacy enhancing technologies to development. And so I thought, where would privacy controls fit in, or control assessments? And maybe and also the privacy impact assessment. So I made some notes, like I improved it myself, but I don't know if it's correct, like the
I cannot see it, but
leads to here. And at the end of the life cycle, there are the controls and the control assessments. So I was just thinking what you, Jaap-Henk or Naomi, when you read this book and this chapter or wrote this, what you thought, how would this map maybe to other frameworks that we already have?
That's a superlative question and a tough one, to be honest. And Naomi and I and others have actually been sort of like working on that a bit, trying to map that out. So maybe Naomi can talk a bit more about that later. One of the things that I'm going to pick out of this is this thing that you mentioned about the dpias on the one hand and the privacy by design process on the other. And this is something that I would want to investigate further, because this for me is a bit of an open question, because what I've seen so far is that the DPIA happens somewhat later on in the process, basically when a rough sketch or maybe something that is already very close to finishing in terms of architecture of the system is out there, and then you can sort of start like, okay, checking the boxes, so to speak. There's of course a way to do stuff, but then that is never going to influence the design in a fundamental way. All that you do in that phase is then maybe, you know, add a few controls to mitigate any remaining risks. And also it doesn't really interface with whatever happens during the design phase to begin with. So one thing that will be super interesting is to see how you could do the DPIA process, which is mainly more like, they say, legal driven, in parallel to the design process that is more engineering driven. And if you can somehow create synchronization, create a shared language to allow these different groups to communicate more effectively during that process. But that's, to be honest, that's work in progress. And maybe Naomi has some more to say about that as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that in terms of the graphic, it fits. I mean, at NIST, we sort of think of, you know, controls in sort of 3 phases. So select controls, implement them, and then assess them. So, you know, I mean, just on the face of it, I would say that selection comes, so in definition, you know, you're thinking about the requirements, and hopefully you've done a privacy risk assessment and as well as looked at your legal obligations. And those sort of come together to help you figure out sort of the requirements that you want for the system. And then you're able to select the controls in the design phase, and sort of emerges, I think, into implementation and development. So the difference between implementation and selection is really about, you know, you can select a control, but then when you actually put it into a specific system, you might have to tinker with it, right? Everything is contextual. And then, you know, and then when you get to evaluation, I would say that's very much where you would assess your controls and make sure they're operating as you intended. And if not, you're back in the circle of selecting or tinkering to re-implement. So I think it works perfectly in my opinion.
Rob, let me bring you in.
Yeah, what I really liked were all the examples. I mean, you start with the car park example, and it also triggered an example which I want to bring to the table, and you obviously will recognize, and it's the example of the public transportation tickets in the Netherlands. We had like a blue card, but we also had like the red card, and the red card was a disclosure of the attribute that you would basically be able to get use of the transportation system for a discount. And this triggers basically the problem of identity disclosure, which I liked a lot, because you also describe IRMA in the book, which is also a good mechanism to to use this technology to disclose and to be in control of whatever you want to disclose about yourself. But it also triggered the example of the Windows card spaces that were part of the operating system for many years. And Kim Cameron wrote his laws of identity. But there's also the current work in the W3C on use cases and requirements for decentralized identifiers. Well, all this leads me to the interesting and more broader question, which is to what extent has the privacy as control paradigm become incompatible with data systems based on central design? And that would require the processing of metadata as well. So that's a little bit of my take.
I think there's a sort of intuitive understanding, also from my side, that if you are able to process your data locally with your own devices or the devices that are under your own control, you have more control. But that does presuppose a few things. That does presuppose a kind of like, first of all, that those tools really work as advertised and as intended. Maybe also the ability to get these tools certified, accredited, or checked by independent consumer organizations. And it also assumes that users are act responsibly, which they not necessarily do. So even though one of the strategies that I developed for the privacy design strategies was the separate strategy, where this whole idea is like, okay, if you move the processing to the endpoints, you really make it much harder for there is no central authority, but even if there were, the central authority would not have that much information to go by. So from a technical perspective, that offers a lot of protection. But then again, we had the discussion earlier about federated learning. Maybe it doesn't. Then that protection mechanism fades already a bit. But I guess in the end, also with more centralized systems, provided that you can trust the provider of the system, you can also have a lot of control. It's just a matter of like how do you implement that?
A lot of us seem to be eager to assign you a second book in this direction to build out some of the topics that you raised, like, okay, how should we re-architect the internet, or even to go further into some of the topics around secure multi-party computing and the like. And, you know, again, I don't want to be telling you the directions to go, but what was really lovely was the way you took some of the, you know, more complicated technology issues and really put them out in a very accessible way. And you already heard the support for sort of the fact patterns, which people always like. Gwendol flagged that as well as just like not only a good educational thing for the students, but for organizations that have some version of whatever is being talked about, sort of seeing how at least one expert sort of, you know, goes through the analytical process. So are you already thinking of book 2 here, or you have other fish to fry, or what's
there's so many fish to fry, but yes, I actually have been toying with writing another book, because this was a fun, surprisingly to me actually, a fun experience to do, but that book is maybe more oriented, actually it's sort of like maybe a similar audience, but more targeted to my students in the IT in the context of the law course, where I try to teach my law students at the University of Groningen, where I'm an associate professor in law, even though I have no law degree whatsoever. I try to teach them something about technology, and this is of course a challenge, because, like, you know, finding the right hooks, sort of like the right metaphors, the right examples that they can sort of attach new knowledge to, that's a challenge. And I found some books that do that, but they don't really cover everything that I want to cover. So that is something that is sort of like in the back of my mind. But that's not only about privacy, but that is partly about the stuff that I write about in the chapter 2 about how the internet works, how computers work, and how you should look at that as a lawyer in your law practice as an IT lawyer. That will be something that might be interesting to work on, but maybe there's other stuff as well.
One of the members of our audience raises a question, which I welcome anybody here replying to. We're talking to some degree to the developers here and the technologists to some degree. And are they stuck in the middle of this world where everybody's telling them more data, all the data, and are they positioned to be the ones who push back here? Do the privacy engineers have the seniority or the role in the organization? You teach, computer science students, I think, yes?
Mhm.
Are they, we have the young generation sort of bottom up today, creating change. Is this what we expect to see? Perhaps the next generation of engineers sort of saying, hey, this is not the way to do it, or are we talking to the wrong people? Is this up to the lawyers who have to be the GDPR is not going to allow this? Or do we expect that the systems designers are really the right people to be shaping these decisions?
In my experience, in most of the cases, when I talk when I talk to my students, or also when I talk to engineers out there creating new systems, I think most of them are aware of the privacy issues. Some of them would want to push back. I don't think that they have the power to push back, to be honest. I mean, in the end, the engineering team builds whatever is being decided by the business. So if you really want to have a change, it should be a business-led change. And that might actually mean, I've had several conversations about this with other people as well, or even today, in fact. And I also mentioned that in the book, like the big elephant in the room is the business model. Like the reason why companies like Facebook are organized the way they are is because of the business model. It's conceptually easy to think of a social network as a peer-to-peer network, right? I mean, it's about friends sharing stuff directly with their friends. That is peer-to-peer by definition. That's not how Facebook is structured. Why is that not structured that way? Well, you need decentralization in order to get the business model working. So the question there is then, okay, if you really want to have a change, maybe you should also look at the business model and look at like a bit like environmental law, where in let's say 60 years ago, it was perfectly normal to produce something and just dump the waste into the water, and then you make it an externality. So therefore the cost is not yours. But then at some point society started realizing there's a cost involved as society. So we have to push back. And I think that the same is with privacy. There's a cost involved with all this. So we have to push back and maybe change the incentives and maybe change the business models. And like we did environmental law, basically saying, okay, you cannot dump waste. That is a business model that is not allowed. So we have to do, so things like child labor is also a business model that's not allowed. So you can also do stuff there if you really want to make a change. And I think, and together with the GDPR that already does stuff, these kind of like incentives from all the different directions will effectuate change. And this book and the fact that the engineers know how to do this, depending a bit on who you talk to, is one step, but it has to be combined with other efforts to really make that change.
Gloria.
Yes, just to provoke a little bit, because now you say, yes, the business is really not taking us as in the good direction, but I think in the book there is a sort of also a clear message against the government, because you really say, when the government has laws saying which data we can process, they always go too far. You seem very skeptical about the government getting the balance right, or so is it the problem? Is it the business? Is it the government? I suppose if you go through the climate metaphor, everybody is wrong and only Greta is right. But I don't know, how do you frame this?
Oh yeah, no, thank you. Yeah. So if we talk about business models, we only talk about businesses, and that totally glosses over the fact that governments are using similar models to do stuff. And like in the Netherlands, we have this great example about the taxation office that used illegal fraud register to basically just really push people over the cliff. I mean, I'm not exaggerating, and like the repair costs for that alone are running into the billions of dollars or euros in our case. So yes, but then if you talk about governments, then we have to think about different. I don't know, actually, that's an interesting question. And what would be the equivalent of a business model for a government? Maybe somebody can help me here.
Let me ask you all maybe to make some comments without, the goal is not only to put our author sort of on the spot and make it a full book talk,
Please do.
but to schmooze amongst all of you. So I'm curious, Naomi, you work with a lot of the engineering, privacy engineering. Are you more optimistic that there's a bottom-up opportunity as well, that the engineers can sort of say, look, this is the way the system needs to be designed, otherwise it's not fit for purpose? What have you been seeing over the last couple of years?
Well, I guess a few things. So, which I don't know that I'm optimistic, but I mean, so I think early on there was a question about a multiple choice question, and I think number 3 or 4 was on the lawyers, and I do think that's concerning, because I've heard a number of times now at sort of virtual conferences that where we've been talking about privacy enhancing technologies, and the engineers will be like, I can do this really amazing stuff with crypto, and the lawyers just ask me, but are you data processing? And that's just sort of shuts down, and they focus a lot of resources on these definitional issues rather than figuring out what's the most effective way to address privacy risks. And so I think that's discouraging. And then, I'm going to say that recent article, I think in the Washington Post, was it, or in the New York Times? I always mix them up, but on Facebook and some of the papers that were revealed, and that the engineers were raising these questions about their algorithm, and then they got overruled. So I do think that's actually a really important place for case investigations and regulation, because who else is going to manage bad choices other than through those kinds of issues. So I think there's I would say that I don't think that it can just be bottom up, and that is why we wrote a framework for all parts of the organization. But I do think that full disclosure, I was at the Federal Trade Commission for 10 years of my career, and I do think that when the right choices aren't necessarily being made, then there is a role to for regulation to step back in and address those kinds of market failures. So,
Katerina, you had a question, I think, or a comment?
No, I was just thinking, because Jaap-Henk, you mentioned a pushback, and I also thought of the end users' potential pushback. And here I really like, Jules, that you brought the example with the Apple CSAM or flocks. And even though your book really explains IT or privacy enhancing technologies so well, there are so many more technologies that are so much more complex that the end user will never really understand. So this issue of trust, or how to communicate those new privacy enhancing technologies deployed or in applications, we will never be able probably to explain that. And then it's all about, I mean, that's my theory now. Please tell me if I'm wrong. It's all about the PR spin and the communication and the trust of the brand. And so that's what worries me a little bit. And then it could also be that one privacy enhancing technology is mentioned maybe in a very negative context, and then gets this negative connotation to it. So that is what worries me a little bit. It's not so much about privacy by design, but about how it's communicated and the trust.
There was a protest against the Apple CSAM thing run by a number of organizations around the world. So we're not that far here from the big new Apple store in the center of Washington. So I said, well, let me go see a privacy. Where do you see so much like a privacy protest? That's not a common thing that people are taking to the streets. And I got many emails and there was a lot of media that this is going to happen. And I walked down the block at 6 p.m. Eastern when this was supposed to happen, and there was nobody there. So, okay, well, maybe wait a minute. And then the organizer showed up with one friend and a banner, and then one reporter that was there with a TV camera. And I said, well, this is quite interesting. Clearly, the general public didn't even see this as interesting. when I asked some friends, hey, what are you going to do? You heard about, they say, oh, you mean the security update that I should do? I'm like, no, this thing with the child abuse material. And I wonder whether if you took a poll, I know with the issue around the FBI wanting to access, the shooter in California, the phone of the terrorist, the polling was very clear. Yes, of course, you should, go in there. So I think one of the dangers of this issue now being not just one for the geeks and the technologists, who all were very concerned, obviously, are the legislators who at the end of the day reflect democratic society, and the media, able to really opine, or are they, maybe they're right because they're operating at a certain level, but of course we see the conflicts between what some of the regulators and some of the legislators want in terms of safety and so forth. So it's going to be interesting times. Let me give a last word to Rob and Gwendol, and then we'll be at the top of the hour, and we'll go on from there. So Gwendol, let me bring you in for a final thought.
Yeah, first of all, the discussion is very insightful, and we touch upon many different topics. I think we're making some progress on privacy by design in general, and on the technical side, and the book is really contributing to the debate, and this is really something I find very valuable about the book. We also see, and this is something I see more and more in organizations, that there's more debate between the lawyers and the technologists. They start understanding each other better. Not so long ago, or I've seen this in my career also, sometimes you get people from the businesses saying, oh, I want this, and they think they've expressed their needs. They think they've told the IT people what they want from the applications and how it's supposed to work and things like. And I think this is evolving little by little. It's the same with privacy. People are understanding from the business units that they need to be involved in the way that the system is designed to do it in the appropriate way. And I think also now we have pieces of legislation that are putting this together. You talked about dpia before. I think we could do a session specifically on dpia, because it's something that many people are interested in. But in the dpia defined in GDPR, you bridge also this connection between the legal aspects and the technology aspects, and you design the system in a way that is supposed to be privacy friendly and privacy by design. There's a strong link between the two, actually. And so this I think is something which is very important, which you see enshrined in law. And I think for this to work, you need to get a good understanding also at executive level in the organizations, to make sure that this dialogue is actually organized between the technical people, the legal people, and the executives that are deciding. This is moving. It's been well understood in the world of information security, and it's being rolled out little by little, I think, in the world of privacy. And I hope the book can also contribute to this to a certain extent. So I won't ask a new question, because I would have many questions and many follow-up questions, but I'd just like to thank Jaap-Henk again for this great work, because there's a lot of research that has been done there, and making accessible a lot of explanations on many different technologies, possible solutions, and giving I think someone in the chat was saying, I've opened many tabs and I need to look into this afterwards, is really the impression that this book looks. It's a very good teaser to try to understand certain technologies in more detail. And I think this is very valuable for many readers. So thanks again for this.
Rob, I'll give you the last word.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm actually pretty hopeful that engineers will embrace privacy by design at some point. I mean, if I look at standardization processes, it took a long while in the IETF to have a mandatory paragraph, not just for security, but also for privacy implementations. And similarly, in the W3C, we now see this double paragraph, so security recommendations and privacy recommendations. So looking at the engineering process, the way engineers and technologists develop technology, I think it's important that they understand that beyond the functional requirements, the business requirements do have to be taken into account. And I think if we start training engineers to embrace both concepts, and use that in the project management, I think we can come a long way from where we're now.
Jaap-Henk, I thank you folks. If you haven't purchased the book, it's a good investment for your education. It's one of the more educational books, not just an interesting policy discussion. It's got that, but there's really some quality education for those who want to get deeper on a number of topics. So Gloria, Katrina, Gwendol, Rob, Naomi, thank you for joining for this conversation. I think our next book is going to be, we're a bunch of Americans and Europeans here, and the problem with the privacy and data protection debate globally is that it's very often Americans and Europeans, saying our views and so forth. And it's a big world out there, and it's a global world. So We the Robots by Simon Chesterman, who's a law school dean in Singapore, who's writing about AI. So we'll send this out to the book club, and you may have to do this in the evening because Singapore is, I think, 13 hours now. So it'll be the committed people, but also not too big, but really important to have perspectives beyond just the transatlantic ones, given the global challenges. So thank you all, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you all. And if anybody has any questions left, contact me by email or LinkedIn. I'd be happy to answer them privately. And I hope to meet everybody here one way or another in a physical setting and have many more discussions for many more hours, and maybe over a glass of beer or wine, because this was very, very interesting. Thank you so much.
Gabriella notes the AI discussion next week, the virtual Brussels Privacy Symposium with some AI leads from the European government, from around the world, and from the US, where we have some senior voices starting to talk about AI standards in a global sense. So the link is in the chat, and you're all welcome to join us. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.